Welcome to Secret Historian, where forgotten kings, lost empires, and hidden histories are retold to help you relax and drift into peaceful sleep. Most people have an image of the Dark Ages that is engulfed in darkness, with Roman cities falling, roads deserted, trade dwindling, and people living in dread and ignorance and clinging solely to religion. The narrative is repeatedly presented in textbooks, novels, and motion pictures. A post-476 Europe engulfed in the gloom of oblivion. We are compelled to ask, however, was this entire age really nothing but darkness? As new pieces of the past come to light, a faded trade record in Venice, a song of triumph concealed within a Bible, or delicate fragments of paper that once appeared worthless, these are the sources of the answer, not official histories. Official history has frequently opted to ignore the other story that these subdued whispers suggest. We unlock the door to the past in tonight's Bedtime History episode and hear voices that have been suppressed for generations. These are the voices of the so-called ages, and they remind us that resilience is more important than breakdown and despair. Tiny documents, monastic chronicles, private correspondence, and trade reports reveal another tale of human tenacity, one of knowledge, trade, and cultural embers that persisted despite chaos. The monastic chronicles are among the most trustworthy and durable sources we come across as we delve further into the realm of historical whispers. Monks diligently penned sentences they never thought would become future treasures inside the chilly stone walls of scriptoria, which were only dimly lit by candles. It was just a daily obligation to them. Note the year of the famine, the season of the severe rains, the death of the monarch, and the installation of the abbot. However, it was precisely this consistent, seemingly dry routine that kept an entire age's heartbeat intact. These chronicles were frequently little more than a line or two in length, sometimes containing only annual notes. The crops didn't work out this year. There was a comet. The Northumbrians launched an assault. When combined, simple words, insignificant ones, tell us about the climate, natural disasters, conflicts, and deceit. From there, contemporary historians can reconstruct a far more comprehensive picture by cross-referencing data from geology, archaeology, and even climate. An unwritten narrative can be revealed with only one simple sentence. The fact that monastic chronicles documented more than merely significant occurrences adds to their fascination. Many also provide insight into the worldview and mentality of the individuals who lived in those times. Comets and other celestial bodies were frequently interpreted as portents. It is possible to describe a drought in conjunction with penance, practices, or prayers. Here, we witness the merging of nature and supernatural beliefs with reality. As you read those phrases, you can really hear the murmur of a community that is afraid of the unknown, yet is resolved to explain and persevere. Some chronicles also provide us with a remarkably in-depth look into everyday life and the economy. For instance, one document from Corbie Abbey in 8th century France describes how the monks were compelled to use beer made from barley in place of wine during the winter months due to a shortage. It may be a minor detail, but it reveals how crops are being impacted by climate change, demonstrates how adaptable daily living is, and serves as a reminder of how important agricultural products were to religious life. These kinds of notes reveal the intricacy and change woven throughout daily life, shattering the frozen. Events can occasionally be captured with remarkable calmness by these straightforward notes. Thessaly was destroyed that year. The army of the monarch was routed. Just the facts, without any drama or commentary. Later readers are compelled to fill the void with study and creativity due to its striking minimalism. Monastic chronicles serve as a kind of basis. We wouldn't even know where to start without them, even if they don't build the entire house. Sometimes their simplicity allows for wonder. There was a bright light in the sky, shining like day, lasting through the night. According to an Irish chronicle from 774, scientists only discovered that the entry might have been a big solar flare in the 21st century after connecting it to carbon-14 evidence found in tree rings. What started out as a weird message written by an unidentified monk becomes a record of one of the most uncommon cosmic occurrences in Earth's history. This reveals something important to us. Not everything that communities witnessed and experienced is reflected in monastic chronicles. Occasionally, they document natural occurrences that were well beyond their wildest expectations. These archives were created only for memory, and they had no idea how valuable they were. However, it was precisely this humility that made it possible for them to endure as a constant historical rhythm. These chronicles are, of course, limited. They frequently contain a religious perspective penned by monks who lived their whole lives in monasteries, rarely mentioning the specifics of everyday life outside of them. However, that bias is illuminating in and of itself. It provides insight into the worldview and meaning-making processes of the spiritual elite, that is found or decoded as a key that opens a new door. The shaky lines on parchment or the fading ink on vellum no longer give the Middle Ages a gloomy appearance. Rather, they manifest as a web of occurrences, convictions, catastrophes, and profoundly human encounters. If the chronicles of monasteries provide us with the constant pulse of a whole community, personal letters allow us to get a close-up look at the emotions, concerns, and breadth of people's lives during the Middle Ages. Letters offer a glimpse into a different world, whereas official histories typically concentrate on monarchs, conflicts, and dynasties. Intimate relationships, personal worries, and the desire to learn were all carried on brittle pieces of paper in this society. A full cross-border economy can be seen in a single trade letter from the 11th century Mediterranean, while urging his partner to honor his commitment and make the payment on schedule. The writer meticulously details the bales of linen, sacks of salt, and bags of pepper that need to be transported. This administrative record wasn't dry. The handshake was replaced by ink in a spirited conversation. These words provide evidence that medieval Europe was not isolated, but rather had strong commercial ties to the outside world. Beyond commerce, letters also provide insight into the emotional climate of the time. A wife writes to her husband, who is far away, requesting that he bring back a small present for their son, or just expressing some concern. They appear straightforward at first glance, but in the midst of longing, concern, and love, and we discover something eternal when we read them years later. Family, affection, and missing the people we love are still the most fundamental human concerns. A glimpse into the realm of knowledge is likewise provided by several letters. Scholars discussed theological and logical issues, as well as Aristotelian translations. These were written discussions, not formal treatises. They were intimate, occasionally sloppy, and always dynamic. Through these, we can observe how ideas from Ireland to Italy were connected by the continued transmission of knowledge over mountains and seas on scraps of parchment. The variety of voices in medieval writings is what sets them apart. Some were elegantly penned on fine parchment and sealed by aristocrats with crimson wax. Others were quickly scrawled on scraps, the trembling hand of a peasant pleading with his landowner. Together, they create a multi-layered image in which common people without names speak for themselves, and kings also make their mark. The emergence of modern languages is another silent change that can be seen in letters. Several lines of a local dialect may be interspersed with formal Latin at the start of a single page. In these instances, we see Spanish, French, confessions that were never made, and emotions that were too delicate or frightening to convey. A very human feeling that, despite the passage of a millennium, feels remarkably familiar. Rather, we listen to the murmurs of business people, academics, mothers, fathers, spouses, and husbands. They dismantle the barrier of bigotry that depicts medieval Europe as a place of silence and servitude, exposing a world where individuals continued to love, think, and write, leaving behind the most human legacy of all. Trade records provide U.S. access to a completely new world, while personal letters allow us to get a close-up look at the lives of individuals. These are documents that appear rigid and lifeless, full of numbers, signatures, and clauses, rather than rushed notes or sentimental phrases. Nevertheless, some of the most compelling proof, fourth fact, that official history is frequently emerges from this dryness. Europe in the Middle Ages was not a dull place. It was a moving economic entity. Its vitality is pumped through contracts and trade. Thousands of contracts that document the specifics of a transaction have been preserved in the archives of Venice, Genoa, or Bruges. An 11th century document depicts an Italian merchant taking out a loan to purchase goods for shipping across the Mediterranean with the pledge to pay back the principal and interest within 6 months. An early credit system is hidden behind these ostensibly uninteresting lines. Evidence suggests the use of financial instruments to increase trade was already prevalent in the Middle Ages. They took out loans, made contracts, mortgaged real estate, and even included provisions for compensation in the event that dangers materialized. To put it another way, they established the groundwork for modern-day practices like banking and maritime insurance. However, not all significant transactions left a paper trace. Numerous minor interactions are documented in local records: wood for iron, cloth for beer, or even salt for laborers' wages. According to one Flemish contract, 2 barrels of beer are worth 3 rolls of fabric. Another, from northern Italy, documents the exchange of olive oil for wheat. When combined, these small accords outline a multi-tiered economy. These commonplace interactions, which range from village trade to continental trade routes, reveal the true pulse of medieval life, a beat that is frequently obscured by grandiose stories of rulers and conflicts. The fact that the law is involved in these transactions is also remarkable. The majority of contracts contained responsibility clauses, witnesses, and seals. The carrier was required to make up for any lost items while traveling. Property could be confiscated if a borrower defaulted. To resolve conflicts, many port cities even established their own commercial tribunals. Medieval civilization was far from lawless. Rather, it had a robust legal system designed by local communities to safeguard commerce. These were not merely commercial transactions. They demonstrated that a society was capable of maintaining self-control and order. Trade documents also demonstrate Europe's global ties. A Venetian contract depicts a businessman in Egypt making a deal with a Muslim partner. The existence of Hanseatic traders from the Baltic is documented in a Bruges text. Every number has a caravan, a crossbar connection, or a sea path behind it. Contrary to popular belief, medieval Europe was already a node in a global network before it was blocked off. Even shifting societal preferences are shown in some documents. We observe changing preferences when a contract calls for the purchase of cane sugar, a luxury good that was just imported and costs many times as much as wheat. Fine crafts, sugar, and spices were more than just essentials. They turned into status markers. We can learn more than simply about trade from these sites. They show the early emergence of a consumer culture. Risk, of course, accompanied opportunity. There were general average clauses in a lot of contracts. Several parties would share the damage if a ship sank and commodities were lost. In a world where every journey could be the last, this was the basis for the crucial invention of maritime insurance. Those rough lines of ink remind us of brittle ships on choppy waters, where traders staked their confidence and fortunes on ink-written signatures. Importantly, these documents also reveal social structure, including who could testify as witnesses and who was permitted to sign contracts. Women, particularly widows or nuns, are frequently seen engaging in trade and perhaps even lending money. These kinds of details dispel the myth that women in the Middle Ages were completely shut out of the economy. Therefore, we are not merely reading legalese when we hold one of these antique contracts. We are hearing the pulse of a culture that understood how to commit, compromise, and share risk. These texts transformed trade into a sustainable system rather than a matter of luck. Additionally, trade leads us to the realm of law, because medieval law involved more than just business dealings. It established the social order as well as rights and responsibilities. Law was the framework that kept medieval Europe together. If trade was its lifeblood, post-Roman Europe is frequently depicted in popular culture as a lawless wasteland where the powerful reigned and the poor were forced to surrender. However, the surviving legal documents, from written rules to land titles and wills, tell a different tale. Medieval society was far from disorderly. Land contracts are the most basic papers we come with. A 9th century deed could only be a few lines long. In return for 3 measures of grain and harvest labor, Person A gives Person B this land. Witnesses signed the seal, date, and wax. There was a legal structure underlying that brevity. Swordplay and conquest were not the only ways to acquire land. It was committed to memory and bound by agreement. Uncertain power dynamics were transformed into specific duties by a contract. Who was in debt? Who took the harvest? Who provided protection? These pieces of parchment demonstrate a civilization that understood the importance of defining rights and obligations. Inheritance was as essential even during turbulent times. The precise division of property, including which share went to sons, daughters, and widows, and under what circumstances, was outlined in numerous medieval codes. Despite its strictness, the well-known Salic Code of the Franks meticulously described how family wealth was maintained. Records in Italy even show that women in certain situations signed agreements themselves or kept land after their husbands passed away. This particular evidence casts doubt on the widely held belief that medieval women were totally excluded from positions of economic influence. Despite its inequity, the law nevertheless created limited areas for survival and bargaining. The idea Aufwergild, or the price of a person, was one of the most notable developments in medieval law. The rule established defined amounts of compensation for each harm, preventing feuds from degenerating into never-ending cycles of retaliation. There was a cost associated with livestock theft, physical injury, and even murder. Despite its icy tone, this approach prevented violence. Communities decided to end hostilities through recompense rather than unending slaughter. It served as a system of peace and order. The more we learn, the more we realize that medieval law was more than just the law of the powerful. A surprisingly human touch permeates many decisions. According to a small-town lawsuit from the 11th century, this family is unable to pay back their debt in full. They will starve if forced. In order to allow them to live, half of the debt is erased. According to a different city code, the price of bread must remain reasonable. Modest attempt to maintain social equilibrium. The law wasn't always fair, of course. Many codes punished the same crime with unequal weight, punishing peasants more severely than nobility. The law revealed disparity while maintaining order, and that's the exact reason it seems so real. It depicts a civilization that must balance the demands of power with the ideals of fairness. The fact that the law established a common memory was what really counted. Every action, decision, and copied code served as a fulcrum for communities to hold into. Those promises persisted and were recalled, invoked, and repeated even after kingdoms fell or conflicts erupted. In this sense, law became the era's common memory. The reality is revealed when we juxtapose these legal papers with private correspondence, business records, and monastic diaries. The Middle Ages were a maze of laws, strict yet adaptable, unfair yet compassionate, rather than a lawless blank. Law served as society's unseen skeleton, keeping it from collapsing into anarchy. Despite its intricacies and shortcomings, medieval law served as a mirror and a shield. It demonstrates that people in this time period were more than just soldiers or slaves. In order to coexist, they were also willing to bargain and make concessions. And while those harsh writings kept society in place, poetry, folklore, and stories were creating a softer, more emotional world. Words were no longer merely used to document laws or transactions in the realm of medieval literature. They developed into a means for individuals to dream, share wisdom, and bare their souls. The most obvious evidence that the so-called Dark Ages were anything but quiet may be found in these texts. From myths, legends, and love stories to awkward poetry scrawled in monasteries, they reverberated with voices of all types. The majority of these pieces were never officially recorded in history. They endure in fragmented manuscripts, in handwritten notes in Bible margins, and in bundles of parchment that have been forgotten for generations. Nevertheless, these pieces reveal a literature of common people that is much less slickened by religious or political ambitions. A monk's homesickness is encapsulated in a brief poem in the margin of a Bible. Children learn about honesty from a handwritten narrative. A night lost on the way home from combat is described in a ballad. They are shards on their own, but when combined, they create a colorful mosaic. We get a glimpse of a vibrant world of imagination, particularly in folk stories and local epics. Despite their descriptions of valiant warriors, dragons, and monsters, Anglo-Saxon literature also contains poignant themes of loss and exile. The songs of Roland or the Knights of Charlemagne are more than just heroic tales in the literature of ancient France. They struggle with honor, loyalty, and treachery. There are real personal conflicts beneath the armor of epic poetry that are just as important as any work from later eras. The distinctions between philosophy, theology, and art were muddled in many works. Can human reason truly grasp God's will? Was a question posed in certain literature. Some express their admiration for nature simultaneously as personal expressions of awe before beauty and as hymns to the divine. Here we discover a level of consideration that the term dark overlooks. In addition to transcribing literature, monks, academics, and poets were also writing new chapters in the cultural narrative. The linguistic diversity of medieval literature is among its most remarkable features. Literature began to appear in local dialects such as Old French, Old English, and Middle High German. Although legal documents and chronicles were typically written in Latin, they started to discover their voice, making writing more accessible to the general public. This change marked a turning point in the development of national literatures. A folk ballad in Welsh, a love ballad in rustic French. These weren't merely artistic creations. Cultural identity markers were what they were forming. We occasionally discover unanticipated treasures among lost manuscripts. La Fontaine was eventually influenced by medieval stories. Chaucer and Dante were influenced by ballads that were found in faded copies. The foundation for Europe's finest literary voices was set by works that were originally regarded as modest and anonymous. Seeds were being sown, ready to sprout, even in the dark. Other texts provide literary snippets of everyday life. An introverted love poem about trading apples in the marketplace. A joke about a gluttonous monk written by hand. A song about summer wheat harvest. Through them, we perceive peasants, merchants, and artisans as the main characters in their own stories, rather than as supporting characters in legal documents. Real life was not the only thing reflected in medieval literature. It also offered individuals hope and purpose. Writings frequently had a consoling tone during wars or disasters, reminders that spring will return after the long winter. Poems comparing human existence to the seasons, and tales of saints who performed healing. These pages served as tiny sparks that kept hope for the future alive. And we learn from these brittle pieces that darkness is a fictitious viewpoint. Indeed, at this time, new literary genres, languages, folk customs, and vernaculars were being developed as cultural pillars. The Renaissance and the modern era would not have had a base upon which to grow without them. Once retrieved, these lost voices alter cultural history, demonstrating that literature's fallen is never extinguished, it was only concealed. Dreams were not the only thing found in literature. It also served as a springboard for more in-depth inquiries. What is the mechanism of the universe? What is the purpose of human existence? How far can faith and reason go together? Philosophy and science started to emerge from this desire to look beyond the written word, silently, steadily, but with an unwavering force. Many monks preserved and annotated the classical writings of Greece and Rome in the monasteries. In addition to copying the Bible, Galen, Cicero, Boethius, and Aristotle, medieval academics' perseverance allowed these names to endure across the ages. They didn't simply copy, though, to make the literature fit their own environment. They analyzed, discussed, and occasionally even changed it. For instance, a monk writing in the 9th century would paraphrase Aristotle on logic before adding his own thoughts on the connection between faith and reason. This demonstrates that medieval philosophy was more than just repetitive. It was an ongoing conversation between the past and the present. However, science was far from non-existent in its early beginnings. The teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, as well as the first-hand accounts of medieval physicians, plague records, symptom descriptions, and even experimentation with regional plants, can all be found in medical texts. In addition to prayers, other texts demonstrate an intriguing fusion of traditional knowledge and classical medicine, employing local plants for therapeutic purposes. Despite its flaws, this combination of science and religion served as the foundation for modern medicine. Even astronomy had an impact. Monks documented comets, solar eclipses, and planet motions. This was initially just done to set the dates of religious holidays. But as time went on, these observations became crucial information for modern scientists and historians. For example, the appearance of the aurora borealis was documented in a 9th century manuscript from Fulda Abbey, which has subsequently been independently verified by modern science. Now, what appeared to be unsteady ink on paper has become invaluable scientific evidence. The desire to bring faith and reason together is also evident in medieval philosophy. Profound questions were posed by intellectuals such as Augustine and Anselm. Is it possible to use logic to prove the existence of God? Does heavenly revelation contradict natural knowledge? These discussions, albeit in a religious framework, were just as intense as those in ancient Greece. The intellectual underpinnings of future Europe were shaped by medieval philosophy and religion, which were fueled by this very tension. It's also critical to keep in mind that several scientific and philosophical writings made their way to Europe via Byzantine and Islamic bridges, in addition to monasteries. Aristotle's Avicena and Averroes were brought back to the West through translations from Arabic into Latin, which opened up new possibilities. These pieces weren't just copies, though. They were challenged, rethought, and modified. A monk in Paris in the 12th century might read Aristotle in Arabic and then offer a Christian critique of him. This demonstrated that information was never totally closed off and represented cross-border intellectual communication. Simple math problems and notes on geometry and arithmetic are among the lost documents, demonstrating that education never fully disappeared. Children were taught to write, count, and even the fundamentals of logic in many locations. Even in its most basic forms, rational thought has endured, as evidenced by the shaky lines of a student's notepad, occasionally with doodles in the margins. All of this makes us reevaluate the outdated stereotype. The so-called Dark Ages were a time when people struggled to conserve and reconfigure knowledge in a harsh world, not when they stopped thinking. Their perseverance over thousands of documents demonstrates an enduring intelligence and paves the way for future discoveries. People were pursuing knowledge across far-off highways, even while it smoldered silently in schools and monasteries. Books were not the main source of curiosity. It forced feet to wander, leaving behind crude maps and journey journals that were brimming with the spirit of exploration. Medieval Europe is frequently pictured as a continent that is imprisoned in terror and closes in on itself. However, the drawings and phrases preserved on parchment convey a different tale. In this era of perpetual migration, traders, pilgrims, and even anonymous nomads united seemingly disparate regions. The most notable of these works are merchant diaries. An 11th century Italian trader's little journal documents his experiences on the Adriatic, the cost of dried fish at Ragusa, the fluctuating monsoon winds, and his fear of pirates. He talks about the sunset at a port in Byzantine, where products from Asia and Africa were pouring in on a different page. These strewn-about notes allow us to imagine a Europe that was alive and pulsing with the rest of the world. Countless pilgrim journals accompany them. People traveled by foot to Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago de Compostela. They wrote of towns, hotels, encounters and perils, illness, bandits, and storms as they traveled. But wonder was coupled with adversity. A pilgrim from England in the 12th century wrote a detailed account of the big mosques of Islam and the spice marketplaces of the Mediterranean. The journey was more than simply spiritual for him. It was a window into a more expansive world. Despite being far from precise by today's standards, medieval maps indicate something significant: the way humans thought about the world. Some were depicted as circles, with Europe, Asia, and Africa extending forth like petals from Jerusalem at the center. Others populated far-off places with bizarre symbols, such as limitless rivers in the east and monsters in the north. The need to organize the unknown and to conquer dread via drawing, it was the driving force behind the imagination. And some of the maps were surprisingly accurate. The Mediterranean and Nile are depicted with remarkable clarity on the 8th century Vitus map. Despite its tale, the 13th century Hereford map shows the growing geographic knowledge acquired via pilgrimage and trade. This demonstrates that creativity always coexisted with a consistent endeavor to gather authentic information, transmitted by travelers and recorded for posterity. Additionally, travel journals provide us with invaluable insights into everyday life. A Flemish businessman explains using salt rather than cash to pay a ferryman. In a letter, an Italian scholar laments that the inn where he stayed only offered sour wine and hard bread, and that the prices were double those of Venice. More than any chronicle, these seemingly insignificant complaints give the Middle Ages vitality. When taken as a whole, these works serve as a reminder that Europe remained open to the outside world despite the alleged gloom. Egypt and Italian traders exchanged spices. Jerusalem was reached by English pilgrims. North America was reached by Norse explorers traveling by ship. Although each trek was perilous, they all demonstrated the same reality. The frontier was never the end of human curiosity. Additionally, maps and travel journals show how creativity and intelligence coexist. Maps were more than just tools. It expressed how people perceived the world, large, intricate, yet still able to be captured with pen and paper. These works, when positioned among the literary, scientific, and philosophical writings of the era, serve as a reminder that medieval thought was not confined to the walls of monasteries. It traveled the world, making its imprint on each and every page of soiled paper. We now face a difficulty, though, after witnessing this mosaic of exploration, philosophy, culture, and business. How are all these texts decoded? Few things need as much patience or painstakingness as spending hours or even days trying to trace lettering Thothas gotten shabby on a piece of faded parchment. Sweat, tired eyes, straining in lamplight, and the commitment of linguists, historians, and archaeologists, those who become bridges between the past and present, are behind every line we can read today. The first barrier is language. Classical Latin was very different from medieval Latin. It added entire clusters of new vocabulary, changed sentence structures, and merged regional dialects. Even a seemingly straightforward line can have three or four levels of meaning, and a single misspelt word can completely alter the context. Furthermore, numerous papers were written in languages that are now only fully decoded by a small number of specialists, including Middle High German, Anglo-Saxon, Old French, and vernacular. Every spelling error and geographical variation has the potential to become a maze. Handwriting is the second challenge. Monks, businessmen, and scholars all wrote in a variety of styles, such as the fast, slanted scroll of commercial notes, the dense tangles of Gothic, or the clean strokes of Carolingian script. A single text may occasionally have multiple hands, layered by various scribes, and time has only gotten worse. Fragments of parchment stained with ink faded like ghosts. In order to recreate the original form, decoders must learn to see through the blur by comparing thousands of samples. They frequently encounter plimps, which are written over and scraped clean parchments. There are remnants of the old ink beneath the fresh one. Scholars must dissect each page, which resembles a double painting, using tools like microscopes, UV light, and even digital imaging. Deciphering a manuscript at those times is like digging up geology, with fresh layers burying the old, and the researcher carefully revealing each one at a time. The cultural divide comes next. A small mark could have a very different meaning than what it means to us now. A cross could be a religious emblem, a period, or an accounting mark, depending on local legislation. A statement stating that the community was given the land could indicate quite different things. Without proper context, translation runs the risk of seriously distorting entire histories and leaving many writings unfinished. A half page was lost from a commercial contract. A chronicle had its corner burnt, and a letter had only its first few lines left. By cross-referencing other sources and making educated guesses, scholars must put them together like jigsaw pieces. The work is a combination of art and science, that calls for both imagination and care. However, the art is beautiful because of these challenges. A doorway is opened with each recovered character. A step closer to the past is made with each translated sentence. Researchers are doing more than simply translating words. When they revive a long-forgotten passage of poetry or a long-forgotten legal provision, memory translation is what they are doing. Our entire perception of an age can occasionally be completely appended by a small detail, such as the cost of pepper or a marginal exclamation. These days, technology is helpful. Chemical analysis, artificial intelligence, and multispectral scanners all uncover previously unintelligible language. However, understanding context and placing words in their proper historical flow still requires human hands and minds. It takes more than technique to decipher. It is a combination of historical intuition, cultural awareness, and language expertise. And the amazing truth is right here. There was never total silence in the past. It can only communicate in a language that takes time to understand. Deciphering difficulties are challenges rather than obstacles. They are assessments of our fortitude and curiosity. We start to see the light beneath the dust after we get past the haze of time, language, and symbols. At that point, archaeology and text come together to reconstruct a more complete image of a time period that we have all too long only been aware of through prejudice. Archaeology is the voice of the past expressed via stone, broken brick, pottery, shards, and human bones. If texts are the voice of the past expressed in ink, and only when the two get together does a more complete picture start to take shape. The cost of salt or the fear of piratesis revealed in manuscripts. Trade is shown by contracts. Poems express emotions. What the books leave behind, however, is expanded upon, challenged, or confirmed by archaeology using the quiet of objects. The concept of the Dark Ages itself starts to fall apart because of this collaboration. Consider trading as an example. Salt, spices, and textiles are frequently mentioned in documents. We didn't realize how global the economy was until archaeologists discovered Chinese ceramics in the port of Venice, Indian peppercorns in a 9th century German burial, and Arabic currency in Northern Europe. The artifacts behind each dry line of ink demonstrate that trade routes actually extended from the Mediterranean to Asia and from Scandinavia to the Middle East. Additionally, archaeology sheds light on everyday life and the minutiae that many authors overlook. An account of a monastery would say, "This year the harvest failed." These traces give the story more substance and transform hazy accounts into specific tales with causes and effects. Another story is told via architecture. Although invasions are frequently described in written records, the remnants of strong gates, towers, and walls show tenacity. They did not just devastate towns like Lucca in Italy or York in England. They maintained urban life while rebuilding and reorganizing. The idea of a Europe reduced to dispersed, dead communities is directly challenged by these ruins. Cultural diversity is even revealed by archaeology. Cemeteries present a different tale than the uniformity of faith that religious writings attempted to enforce. Graves display a combination of folk and Christian customs, Crosses are accompanied by non-Christian burial items, bronze, mirrors, and amulets. In contrast to the Church's intended monochromatic picture, this evidence depicts a much more diverse and vibrant spiritual world. Archaeology has occasionally verified things that were previously written off as myth. A weird light in the sky might be mentioned in a chronicle, and scientists now know it was probably a big solar flare when compared to carbon-14 data found in tree rings. A plague may be described in a manuscript. Additionally, signs of the Black Death causing bacterium Yersinia pestis have been found in teeth examined by archaeologists. Therefore, archaeology is more than just textual illustration. It turns ambiguous language into factual information. However, there are situations when it contradicts them. Chronicles may state that raiders totally destroyed a city. However, only decades later, excavations reveal life still existing and even flourishing. An SMS message may say completed line. However, a very high degree of prosperity is demonstrated by your facts, jewelry, tools, and exquisitely made items. These conflicts serve as a reminder that history is not a monolith. Ink and earth are having a continuous conversation. Archaeology and literature work together to bring the past closer to us. You can view the scales, weights, and ceramics excavated from the same location at a museum after reading about a busy market in a traveler's journal. Words become concrete reality. We know that poetry was not fantasy when it depicts the landscape, and archaeologists fin terraced fields, cowbells, or plow. Blades' reflection was what it was, and we can obviously see that through our partnership. The Dark Ages weren't complete gloom. Rather, they were a hazy image that awaited clarification from artifacts and words. And now that the pieces are starting to fit together, we have a more potent tool than ever before. Reading the past is becoming nothing less than a revolution in knowledge thanks to modern technology, digital imagery, chemical analysis, and artificial intelligence. If archaeology talks through stone and bone and texts, provide us with the written voices of the past, then contemporary science opens a whole new avenue. No longer can the past be read with the human eye alone. It can now be decoded using chemical traces, invisible light, and even artificial intelligence algorithms. With the use of these instruments, scholars have transformed the study of the so-called Dark Ages into an advanced expedition in which even the tiniest particle of dust can reveal a tale. Multispectral imaging is among the most significant innovations. Previously, manuscripts were overwritten, erased, or smudged. Palimpsests that are invisible to the naked eye can now be seen under X-ray, ultraviolet, or infrared light. Suddenly, old ink that has been wiped away for eons comes back. This has resulted in the recovery of hundreds of texts that were previously believed to be lost forever. Aristotle's manuscript in a monastery in Sinai is a well-known example. The classical masterpiece was obscured by biblical writing that was written over it. However, the Greek philosophy resurfaced with multispectral imaging, reverberating over a millennium. Additionally, chemical analysis has become essential. Researchers can ascertain the age, place of origin, and even the trade networks that provided the materials by examining the composition of ink. You could tell it was manufactured from Spanish minerals by looking at a drop of ink. Evidence that the text was formerly transported via extensive trading channels. Secrets are even revealed by an parchment, what it tells about the society that produced it, the animal from which it originated, and the treatment it received. These specifics turn a manuscript from a piece of text into a live, breathing artifact with economic and cultural roots. Radiocarbon, dating and stable isotope analysis have transformed archaeology's methods for dating and comprehending ancient life. We can determine the precise historical period and climate conditions from a piece of wood, a grain of wheat, or a bit of bone. When compared to travel notebooks or monastery chronicles, this information validates or rectifies the narrative. Tree rings indicating drought or isotopic evidence of starvation in human remains can now be compared to a line reading from the year the harvest failed. Ancient DNA is arguably the most significant development, and traces of Yersinia pestis were found in the teeth of plague victims buried in cemeteries from the 14th century, proving that the Black Death was a real disease and not a myth. Additionally, DNA reconstructs human migrations, which were frequently only obliquely documented in medieval writings. All of a sudden, we view the Dark Ages as a period of ongoing social change rather than stagnation. Another advancement has been made by artificial intelligence. AI can now be taught to identify medieval handwriting, categorize letters, and even provide interpretations for portions that are damaged. Scholars may now complete tasks that used to take a lifetime in a matter of months. However, humans are not replaced by AI. It broadens their perspective, enabling researchers to concentrate on context and significance. The discipline of history itself is changing as a result of this covert collaboration. Digital technology goes one step farther. Manuscripts can be shared globally for study by thousands of experts after being scanned in 3 dimensions, with damaged pages repaired and faded characters brightened. By digitizing archaeological sites, we can explore ruins without ever leaving our homes. Archives no longer contain the past. It is now accessible to everyone as a live library. However, these developments also present new difficulties. How will we interpret the past with so much raw data? Does history run the risk of being reduced to meaningless statistics devoid of human complexity? Or is this a chance to bring science and the humanities together to simultaneously measure and feel? One thing is evident regardless of the response. The Dark Ages are now one of the most active areas of historical study because of modern instruments. If we listen with both technology and imagination, every buried line, ink, trace, and dust grain suddenly has a voice. At this time, the most exciting part occurs as preliminary findings come into sharper perspective. We get our first look at what was previously unknown when unexpected information merges via translations and analysis. Facts that are so startling that they make us stop talking because they contradict our preconceived notions about the past. The arduous process of decoding and the astounding capabilities of contemporary technology may not be the most poignant moments in this entire adventure. The moment when faded lettering, shattered artifacts, or dead numbers unexpectedly join together to reveal a new truth, however, is the time when we first glimpse what was previously unknown, a moment when history, which we had long assumed was unchangeable, suddenly shifts and reveals something very different from what we had previously thought. Imagine a scholar who, after months of studying a hazy manuscript, eventually discovers that a single essential phrase in a trade ledger refers to pepper rather than salt. This indicates that by the 9th century, pepper from India was arriving in Europe much more frequently than we ever thought. This small finding adds more than a footnote to the history of economics. It changes our understanding of medieval trade by demonstrating that international networks survived a period that was previously described as dark. We are struck with the intimacy of other insights. After being fully deciphered, a seemingly regular letter reveals rushed love poetry, written in the margins. The lines were shaky, and the calligraphy awkward, but the emotion was genuine. Even in the strict monastery environment, human love transcended the regulations. A single, vulnerable moment like this dispels the myth of a fierce obedience only. Europe by demonstrating that individuals still had desires and dreams. Sometimes archaeology and text coincide, which can be surprising. That year, the sky burnt bright through the night, a chronicle might write. It was often written off as superstition, but now it makes perfect sense in light of tree ring data that shows a sharp increase in radiation, which is indicative of a rare solar flare. History feels alive again, the moment when ancient ink and contemporary science meet. It was a real occurrence that affected the earth and the lives of people who witnessed it, not some far-off fable. Unexpected intricacy is shown by other findings. According to recently deciphered court records, some Italian cities established commercial courts with trial records, legal advocates, and processes by the 11th century. However, this contradicts the notion of a medieval Europe without laws. It makes us realize that there were already islands of order amid the alleged anarchy, fostering the spirit of law that would eventually define Europe's destiny. There is even a poetic elegance to some findings. Researchers discovered a little, nearly undetectable musical fragment, just a few notes in a manuscript of holy songs. It may have been the scribe's idle doodle. However, upon reconstructing it, musicologists found that it reverberated uncannily with a folk tune that is still sung along the Rhine today. 1,000 years' worth aftens subtly demonstrated the persistence of cultural memory, and occasionally, new information disproves preconceived notions, contrary to the long-held notion that medieval women were not allowed to inherit. A land contract from the Rhineland in the 10th century demonstrates that a widow may still own property. Students were encouraged to argue with their teachers instead of just repeating what they had said, according to another monastery record. These minor elements indicate a society that is more varied, adaptable, and occasionally progressive than we had previously thought, shattering the hard image we believed we knew. This is the most important thing. These discoveries are rarely as widely publicized as scientific revolutions. Instead of thunder, they are typically faint murmurs, yet powerful enough to cause us to reconsider a whole period of history. Because history is ultimately shaped by innumerable ordinary details. Details we've all too frequently overlooked, rather than just conflicts or decrees. And a new picture is created as these bits add up. Europe is no longer a darkened nut, but rather one that is subtly changing and getting ready for change. The traditional narrative of a straight line from darkness to light crumbles with each new revelation. We perceive a richly woven tapestry in its place. From this point on, altering history is not only feasible, but also unavoidable. This isn't about making minor adjustments to a textbook. Rewriting history entails completely rethinking our conception of the alleged Dark Ages. In contrast to the brilliance of the Renaissance, that picture has been framed for centuries as a time of ignorance, decadence, and stagnation. However, that outdated framework is no longer valid as unearthed documents and archaeological discoveries continue to show differently. History must be presented as a dynamic current in which light and shade are always entangled, rather than as a tidy progression of darkness and morning. Economic changes are among the most significant. For a long time, we thought that following Rome, Europe descended into poverty and independence. However, contracts, trade logs, and uncovered artifacts demonstrate that networks of trade flourished from the Mediterranean to northern Europe, from regional marketplaces to the Silk Road. What we observe is a reconfiguration rather than a collapse. Centralized imperial systems gave way to adaptable networks with multiple entry points for trade. It wasn't a decrease. Adaptation was the term. It was fortitude. The second change is in the legal and political spheres. The surviving legal writings depict a very complex society in which church law, civic law, and customary law overlapped, competed, and coexisted. Europe was never lawless, as evidenced by communal rights, municipal charters, and commercial tribunals. Actually, it was testing out several order diversity models that would later serve as the basis for nation-states. And the contemporary rule of law, knowledge and inventiveness come in third. Philosophical, scientific, and literary manuscripts demonstrate that human curiosity has never died. People kept asking questions, debating, and trying new things, sometimes going beyond faith, and other times staying within it. Reason and belief discussions, modest poetry, stargazing, and medical observations all allude to a time when learning was not avoided, but rather when a huge laboratory of ideas was kept, remade, and waiting to blossom. The human face of this era, however, may have seen the most significant change. Folk tunes, travel logs, and private letters. They bring the voices of common people back to us. Wives, not just kings, wars or plagues, fretting, pupils grumbling, traders haggling, and peasants singing. These specifics serve as a reminder that history was both the brightness of ordinary existence and the darkness of disaster, and that light never went out. Rewriting the story entails giving up the neat narrative which favors simplicity. Darkness descends, an empire collapses, and deliverance is brought about by the Renaissance. Rather, we have to come to terms with a more messy and honest reality. History isn't always linear. The web is knotted. While some places thrive, others deteriorate. While some years offer pain, others provide rebirth, and it all occurs simultaneously. Naturally, rewriting does not negate the actual difficulties: economic catastrophe, conflict, and disease. These were all genuine and left significant scars. But there was also adaptation and inventiveness, in addition to loss. The fuller truth is that humans persevere, invent, fail, and recover at every age. The deeper message can be found here. The existence of the Dark Ages was never a complete fact. It was a fabrication, a lens designed to exalt the modern and the Renaissance. When that glass is removed, we may see that history was never really dark. It was just that its light was ignored. We'll go into more detail about each of the aspects after this. Knowledge, religion, politics, economics, and social life. We can only reveal the vitality concealed within this much maligned era by attentively examining each dimension. Let's start by going back to the economics, show a reality that is far more vibrant, varied, and unexpected than the stereotype of poverty that we have been taught for a long time. The image that typically springs to mind when we hear the term Dark Ages is of a weary Europe, with fields left fallow, marketplaces empty, and people hunched over bare ground, struggling to make ends meet on their own. For ages, textbooks have frequently featured this monochromatic image. However, a whole other reality becomes apparent when we combine data from art, archaeology, and manuscripts. The economy of the Middle Ages did not vanish. It merely changed its structure, becoming a flexible network with multiple entries instead of an imperial system. It's true that many big cities declined and imperial roots deteriorated after Rome fell, but this did not equate to quiet. The medieval economy was based on innumerable small nodes that were closely connected by fairs, marketplaces, ports, and caravans, rather than a single centralized structure that ruled the continent. In northern France, a small market might exchange salt for wheat. European businesses could be drawn to a champagne fair. Goods from the east might enter through a little port on the Adriatic. These appear to be dispersed pieces up close, yet from a distance they create a live network that is just as active as Rome's. Archaeology supports this view. Archaeologists discovered imported ceramics and exquisite jewelry in German burials. From the 9th century, silver from the south flowed as far north as Scandinavia, as evidenced by the appearance of Arab coins in buried hoards. Remains in England demonstrate the emergence of rural marketplaces where peasants purchased necessities and sold surplus. The economy was obviously not confined to the boundaries of the community. It circulated on multiple levels and was layered. Even agriculture, which has always been seen as unchanging, demonstrates remarkable flexibility. Peasants produced for their own consumption as well as surpluses for trade, according to documents and tools. Hardier grain types were tested in several areas. Others used horse-drawn harnesses and large plows to increase agricultural production. Gradually, innovations like windmills and watermills emerged, increasing output. Back then, rural life was more than just a never-ending struggle. It was an area of technological progress that happened slowly but steadily. The picture becomes much more apparent with urban growth. Important conduits of international trade were established by commercial centers such as Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and subsequently Bruges, Andelbeck. Beyond these giants, however, were innumerable tiny towns that functioned as knots in the web, collecting products, holding fairs, and collecting taxes. Townspeople and merchants developed into a new class, powerful enough to establish town halls, demand autonomy, and organize guilds. They were the driving force for the urbanization of Europe's previously dispersed economy. The art and architecture clearly reflect the richness. If society were confined to bare subsistence, it would never have been possible to construct imposing Gothic cathedrals and Romanesque churches. These needed capital, expertise, and labor surpluses spent on things that weren't necessary for survival. A civilization that was affluent enough to invest in beauty is evidenced by stained glass windows, carved monuments, and commissioned songs. Sharper social stratification is also seen here. Merchants and nobility lived in luxury, but many peasants lived in poverty. The existence of a consumer class that was eager and able to purchase extravagance is demonstrated by gold jewelry, elaborate weapons, and glazed ceramics. Not all of medieval Europe was impoverished. Rather, wealth and scarcity coexisted. In layers, the growth of credit and finance is one aspect that is often forgotten. Evidence of loans, interest, and even crude insurance for products can be found by the 11th century. These behaviors weren't uncommon anomalies. In long-distance trading, their prevalence grew, even though they were still archaic. A shift in economic thinking, where legal pledges and signatures were just as valued as tangible things. The development of banks and contemporary financial markets began with this. Crises were real, of course, raids, starvation, and plague. However, adaptability was compelled by the conflict between expansion and collapse. When one area suffered, another made up for it. Maritime trade grew as agriculture failed. Because of this adaptability, the medieval economy was remarkably resilient. When seen in their entirety, the so-called Dark Ages resemble a mosaic rather than a continent covered in darkness. While some areas prospered, others suffered. There were gloomy and bright moments, and Europe's change was driven by this interaction. The economy of the Middle Ages did not fail. It underwent a transformation, setting the stage for the Renaissance's subsequent growth of trade, art, and knowledge. After seeing how the economy operated, we need to consider who maintained order across all of these transactions, agreements, and interpersonal relationships. The solution can be found in a seemingly arid field that was actually teeming with politics, law, and life, where order was continually negotiated, documented, and recreated in the center of medieval Europe. Politics and the law disclose another reality. If the medieval economy demonstrates that the Dark Ages were far from being destitute, medieval Europe was a multi-layered, intricate, and experimental political environment rather than a chaotic wasteland, a world where authority was distributed, disputed, and continually changing rather than residing only in the hands of kings or popes, is depicted by legal papers, treaties, and commercial courts. Central authority did disintegrate following the fall of Rome. Order did not, however, disappear. Conversely, it made room for fresh political paradigms. Feudalism is the term for the system in which authority passed to local lords in various areas. Feudalism, however, was not anarchy. Oaths of allegiance, land contracts, and obligation records were all documented. A knight pledged loyalty to his master. A villager promised to send crops, all of which were verified by witnesses, documentation, and seals. Although this type of contract law was archaic, it was powerful enough to keep society stable. We see a different picture in the cities. The growth of self-government in cities. Italian communes such as Florence, Pisa, and Venice established independent courts, organized militias, issued their own laws, and founded citizen councils. Charters that have survived show a range of power. In certain instances, officials were elected, merchants formed guilds to protect their interests, and townspeople signed contracts with nobility. These marked the beginning of the that would have a significant impact on contemporary European politics. Medieval diplomacy was also more advanced than people usually think. There were military alliances, economic deals, and peace accords everywhere. Byzantium and Venice struck agreements. The Anglo-Saxons and Frankish kings engaged in negotiations. To protect trade routes, even small towns made agreements. Each contract serves as evidence that medieval Europe preserved a form of early international order in which dedication and compromise were crucial, far from anarchy. The law itself was always a patchwork of overlapping codes rather than a unitary framework. Canon law, feudal law, local customary law, and increasingly civic law were all present. Although they occasionally disagreed, their overlap allowed for discussion and adaptability. Initially filed at a village court, a lawsuit may proceed to a church tribunal before being appealed to a royal court. People learned to negotiate these layers, and records indicate that common people in towns have occasionally even prevailed in legal battles against aristocrats or monks. It may surprise you to learn that medieval law was also remarkably compassionate. A decree in the 11th century made it possible for an impoverished family to subsist by lowering their debt in order to keep the impoverished from rioting. In Hungary, a city law mandated that bread costs stay equal. These rulings serve as a reminder that the law served as a social balance mechanism that reflected community concern in addition to being a weapon of authority. In fact, the law was occasionally overruled by violence and arbitrary decisions. However, when viewed as a whole, the remaining documents demonstrate this. Medieval civilization was a continuous experiment in which institutions and groups fought to establish order rather than being legally empty. The seeds of the contemporary rule of law state were sown in the competition. We are left with another question after observing how the economy operated and how politics and the law experimented with different kinds of order. Was knowledge itself truly lost in the dark if trade was still thriving and the law was advanced? The surprise conclusion is derived from archaeological data and buried texts. Knowledge was no longer exclusive to monks by the 11th century. It was starting to thrive in schools, in cities, and through networks of interchange across continents. The establishment of the first universities was the most obvious turning point. The names we identify with, centuries of Paris and Bologna, did not just appear. They developed from a tradition of discussion and instruction that had been steadily accumulating over many generations. According to school regulations from the 12th and 13th centuries, students might openly question and debate philosophy, religion, and law while gathered around masters. No longer was a lecture a one-sided sermon, it was a conversation. Students contested the teacher's reasoning, and the entire class rationally tested it. Modern science was founded on that attitude of inquiry, to inquire, to argue, and to provide proof. A new intellectual ethic was quickly developed by this atmosphere of free discussion. Writing a thesis was not enough. It had to be put to the test in front of a council. Students learned how to reason, argue, and clearly arrange their thoughts. In this mental space, abilities that served as the foundation for scientific research, translation, and intercultural interaction also fostered the growth of knowledge. Averroes' philosophy, Al-Khwarizmi's mathematics, and Avicenna's medicine all made their way back to the West via Arabic to Latin translations. thanks to Muslim centers in Sicily and Spain. This, however, was not a passive borrowing. After reading Aristotle in Arabic, a Parisian scholar might produce a commentary on him that critiques him from a Christian point of view. Selective adoption, debate, and adaptation produced an intellectual current that cut over cultural and theological boundaries. Scholastic thought matured by the 13th century. Thomas Aquinas and his contemporaries created a system for balancing faith and reason, since earlier philosophers like Augustine and Anselm had just established the framework. Aquinas used a dialectical reasoning technique while using Aristotle to clarify Christian philosophy. Each assertion had to be made, contested, and then rationally supported. It was more than theology. It was instruction in organized thought, a technique that is still used in contemporary philosophy. Knowledge, however, was not limited to theory. Real-world experience was equally important. A nameless knowledge that permeates the workshops is shown by the geometric drawings, mechanical diagrams, and architectural sketches found in craftsmen's notebooks. Building Gothic cathedrals, timber bridges, or watermills requires technical expertise and exact calculations, although this knowledge was not found in academic literature. It was crucial for day-to-day living and helped pave the road for later developments. Evidence of logic can be found as early as elementary school. Basic exercises can be found in student notebooks. All A must be C if every B is C and every A is B, although it appears straightforward. It demonstrates how logical reasoning has become a fundamental concept in the classroom. These wobbly lines are evidence that rational thought was subtly establishing itself in an era that was formerly stigmatized as being dumb. All of this shows that the Middle Ages was more like a nursery of ideas than a nothingness. Philosophical, debatable, translational, and craft-related seeds sprang up alongside one another and fed off one another. They exploded into the full forest of the Renaissance when the social and economic circumstances were favorable. It was merely a shroud of darkness. Knowledge had never been extinguished. It had just been waiting for the right opportunity. Furthermore, we cannot overlook the influence of religion and spirituality, which have long been viewed as monolithic once we realize how well knowledge spreads. In contrast to the idea of a universally shrouded Europe behind the vestments of the church, the religious life of the Middle Ages was actually far more colorful, diverse, and conflicted. The idea of Europe crushed under the total control of the church is frequently associated with the Dark Ages in the popular imagination. Ordinary people live in terror of strict commandments, clergy controlling thought, and religion imposed from above. However, a different picture is revealed when we re-examine lost documents and archaeological data. Religious life in the Middle Ages was far from homogeneous. It was multi-layered, full of innumerable voices, customs, and experiences. Indeed, the Roman Catholic Church established a vast power structure that extended from the Pope in Rome to the smallest parish, via bishops, priests, and others. This appeared to be a smooth order at first glance. However, there is variability everywhere at the level of individual towns, tombs, and manuscripts. First, under the Christian facade, folk beliefs persisted. Archaeology reveals that in addition, 2 bronze crosses, amulets, sun symbols, or items associated with pagan ceremonies were found in numerous burials. Stories about water guardians, wandering souls, and woodland ghosts were still common in rural villages. These regional customs persisted. They were incorporated into regular religious activities and occasionally even showed up as odd, tiny comments in the margins of sacred texts. Unity was never absolute, even within Christianity. There were new religious movements. Extreme aestheticism was adopted by some. Others emphasized compassion and love. Others advocated for spiritual equality. Heresy trials are also described in surviving records. These were threats to the Church. On the other hand, the sheer number of these trials indicates that various views had become sufficiently popular to compel a response from the center. Interfaith engagement was another important factor. Medieval Europe remained open through travel and trade. Christians came across Jews, Muslims, and even far-off religions. In a letter that has survived, a Venetian trader from the 11th century talks about how he was astonished by the friendliness and strange traditions of a Muslim household in Alexandria when they invited him to dinner. In the meantime, Jewish communities flourished as intellectuals and traders in places like Toledo and Mainz, translating Arabic medicine and Aristotle into Latin and acting as essential cultural linkages. In other words, religious life was a cross-border conversation rather than merely the Church's monologue. The personalization of faith is arguably the most notable. We discover extremely personal comments, dreams, uncertainties, and even disappointments in diaries and manuscripts. In the 11th century, a monk admitted, "I pray, but my heart is still empty." Such statements demonstrate that medieval people were more than just submissive slaves. They struggled with themselves, trying to find their own purpose. This variation can even be seen in religious art. In keeping with its Norse roots, a Scandinavian church carved dragons next to crosses. Churches in Sicily used Norman, Islamic, and Byzantine architectural elements to create something distinctive: stained glass, stone sculptures, and frescoes. Yes, they conveyed doctrine, but they also represented regional identity. Faith was always filtered via the prism of culture and was never a single color. When combined, these pieces reveal medieval religion as a colorful patchwork. The continuance of traditional beliefs coexisted with the Church's authority. Inner diversity was concealed by external unity. Personal struggle coexisted with official power. And because of this very diversity, religion became one of the most intricate forces that shaped European history, inspiring art, philosophy, and community. The so-called Dark Ages in religion were therefore teeming with belief, ritual, and individual experience, intertwined, discussed, and shared, rather than a gray, gloomy environment. From that spiritual basis, we now move on to another, equally fascinating area: freedom and social structure, where it is revealed through secret passages that medieval people had far more flexibility to choose how they wanted to live than we previously thought. Medieval civilization is frequently depicted as a strict pyramid in older textbooks, kings and nobles at the top. They were followed by clerics, knights, peasants, and finally serfs, who were permanently confined to the land. That image portrays a stagnant, confined world devoid of alternatives and freedom. However, archaeological data and secret documents are slowly dismantling that oversimplified picture. To begin with, not every peasant was a serfer. There were free peasants who rented land, paid taxes or produced, but had the freedom to relocate elsewhere, as evidenced by the several surviving land contracts. As stated clearly in an 11th century charter, the tenant may return the land and go elsewhere after the harvest. The notion that all peasants were enslaved to the land, even to the extent that freedom of travel was a choice, is clearly contradicted by this. Conditions differed even among serfers. They had to perform forced labor and pay high dues in some regions. In others, they participated in village councils to make decisions on local issues and kept a large portion of their produce. According to certain documents, villages chose their own headmen to resolve conflicts before they ever came before a lord or a bishop. These specifics show that medieval society was not a top-down structure. It also had bottom-up self-governing structures. Contrary to popular belief, women also had additional rights. Widows are shown keeping property and even participating in commercial transactions, in legal documents, and trade contracts. Women from merchant families signed contracts for purchases or loans in various Italian cities. When their husbands were away, women in rural villages took care of the land. Moreover, a lot of wills from the 11th and 12th centuries depict daughters inheriting property. Yes, it is far from complete equality, but it is sufficient to dispel the myth that medieval women were totally invisible. Another social space was formed by medieval towns. Townspeople and merchants emerged as a power distinct from the traditional three categories of clergy, nobles, and peasants as trade increased. Town charters depict craftsmen establishing groups, merchants establishing guilds, creating their own regulations, and protecting their rights from the church and nobility. These marked the beginning of a civil society in which individuals discovered collective power outside of the inflexible pyramid. Even the working class, which is typically depicted as the obedient servants of the aristocrats, was more flexible. Not every knight was born a nobleman. Some were townspeople or peasants who had been promoted due to their wealth or military prowess. Instead of buying permanently faulty, a handful became free knights serving under contract. This made leeway for people to move up the social ladder based on their luck or merit. The existence of collective rights is another intriguing finding. Ponds, woodlands, and pastures were shared by several villages. Agreements outlined rights to fish, graze, and gather wood, along with sanctions for violations. These commons demonstrate that medieval people were not merely subservient. They were adept at organizing and defending the rights of the community. Archaeology enhances the image. Homes from the 10th and 11th centuries have been excavated, revealing robust constructions, a variety of domestic items, and even minor comforts. This demonstrates that there was some flexibility in social hierarchy. Some families were richer than others, even in the same village. Paradoxically, this inequity also made room for social activity. The darker side was still there, of course. Many people were still burdened with serfdom. Real power was out of reach for many women. Numerous communities endured oppression. However, the coexistence of authority, freedom, and common rights, as well as rigidity and flexibility, demonstrates that medieval society was much more diverse than the ancient pyramid model implies. It was more than just the oppressive gloom. It also carried the light of social innovation and adaptation. Daily life restores history to its most human scale. if social structures demonstrate how power functions. After all, wars, treaties, and decrees are not the only ways that history is written. Simple dinners, the bustle of a busy market, festive jokes, and the minor concerns of daily life are all examples of it. Through these remnants, we learn that medieval people, like us today, did not dwell in a time of silence, but rather continued to dream, hope, fear, and love. Archaeology has uncovered fascinating elements from common houses. Archaeologists have discovered animal bones that still have incisions on them, darkened pottery pots, and worn wooden utensils in tiny kitchens. We can infer from this that meals were composed of grains and vegetables, with meat saved for special occasions and served with homemade wine or beer. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and ginger are found in wealthy regions, demonstrating that trade enhanced and varied food culture. Prices for cheese, barrels of ale, or the cost of employing a baker are even recorded in business documents. Little figures that depict everyday life in a tangible and recognizable way. In public life, markets were the center of activity. Seasonal fairs, which served as venues for meeting, exchanging news, and even finding a spouse, were described in chronicles, contracts, and trip journals. The huge fair at Champagne was described by one trader. The locals bring cheese and honey. The Germans bring iron. The Flemings bring cloth. And the Italians bring wine. Scenes like these evoke a vibrant, busy world that is very different from the concept of a gloomy, dead Europe. Folk writing also reflects collective life. There were lullabies with mythical heroes, scathing jokes about gluttonous monks, and work songs chanted in the fields. There is even a remark scrawled in the margin of one copy. I apologize for the misspelling. The cold is making my hand tremble. Although it's only a minor grievance, it forces us to confront a real person who is sitting in a frigid room with a quivering hand, but is still committed to documenting the community's voice. Despite adversity, camaraderie was noted. A story states, that year the harvest failed, but the villagers shared their grain, and no one starved. It's more than simply data. It's a relatable tale of a resilient community. As an early example of social protection, some court documents even document village governments stepping in to control wheat prices and stop profiteering. Another dimension of color was supplied by inversion, festivals, and ceremonies. On some days, entire villages would sing and dance together. Students would make fun of their instructors, and peasants would dress up as nobility. The social order was temporarily upended. Vitality is demonstrated by the brief release itself. People managed to laugh and ignore their anxieties despite the conflict and pestilence. According to a student's travel journal from the 12th century, he arrived in Paris to study in small quarters with flimsy meals, but he was energized by the lively debates with other students. We sense a yearning in those unsteady lines that went beyond the lot of everyday life, a hunger to study, to see more of the world, to alter one's own fate. During the Middle Ages, daily life was anything but routine. It was filled with desire and worry, but it also shared. It was aware of both pain and joy. It was full of promise, but it also contained shadows. And history seems closer and more real than ever within that communal image. A reminder that individuals always manage to live, love, and dream, even during the most trying circumstances. A larger question now arises, after delving into obscure manuscripts that show the depth of Europe's knowledge, religion, economy, law, and everyday life. Why is this era ever referred to as the Dark Ages? In actuality, the phrase was coined by Renaissance and Enlightenment writers rather than the time period itself, and it represents a Eurocentric viewpoint that prioritized Europe over the rest of the globe. The flaw in that outdated classification is exposed when we place Europe in the same context as its peers. The Islamic world was about to enter a golden age, whereas Europe was depicted as being uninformed and unchanging. With its house of wisdom, Bet el-Hikmah Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries developed into a translation and research hub where Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen were not only studied but also developed. The foundations of algebra were established by academics such as Al-Khwarizmi for centuries. The European medical canon was penned by Avicenna. Influence from Mevros's dispute with Aristotle went throughout the Mediterranean. When seen side by side, it is clear that the so-called gloom in Europe was only one aspect of the situation. Elsewhere, intellectual light was blazing. Under the Tang and Song dynasties, China achieved remarkable heights in the East. While European chronicles bemoaned the bad harvests of the 9th century, woodblock printing was already common in China and was producing a significant quantity of volumes. By the 11th century, China was printing with movable type, gunpowder, and the compass, while Europe was just starting its first universities. Not only did these inventions improve battle, they shaped the world at large and increased trade. Via the Silk Road, the Guptas and succeeding dynasties in India left behind a philosophical, mathematical, and artistic legacy throughout South Asia. During the centuries that Europe was purportedly sleeping, ideas like zero, the decimal system, and Buddhist and Hindu philosophical books were still in use, carrying commodities and ideas to Arabia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Indian traders continued to play a crucial role in the Indian Ocean trade. The latter Maya civilization created advanced astronomy, intricate calendars, and gorgeous cities, even in the Americas. Despite the demise of numerous towns in the 9th and 10th centuries, the ruins demonstrated that this was a great civilization going through its own changes rather than a dark society. From the 9th to the 11th centuries, the Ghana Empire dominated the salt and gold trade in Africa, serving as the foundation of a prosperous network that extended from the Sahara to the Mediterranean. Islamic authors write about its wealth in amazement, describing how the abundance of gold astounded foreign tourists. Africa was already a major economic center, despite the common perception of Europe as being impoverished. When taken as a whole, the term Dark Ages only makes sense if we project from a limited perspective, putting Europe at the center and ignoring everything else. However, when viewed globally, the planet appears to be multipolar. Islam and China are thriving. India and Africa are driving extensive trade networks. Europe is reforming, and the Americas are home to great cities and scientific institutions. It was never dark in the world. The lights were in a changing constellation. More significantly, we can overcome the Eurocentric bias thanks to this comparison. It serves as a reminder that there has never been a singular center throughout history. We might picture a knowledge gap if we only consider Europe. Expanding the perspective, however, reveals a universe in motion. side by side, several civilizations are emerging, interacting, and developing. Despite its difficulties, Europe continued to be a link in this global system. Furthermore, this lesson is relevant to the present as well as the past. Both history and the modern world are inherently varied and multifaceted. The light is not monopolized by one center. Every civilization had both its heyday and its downfall. Knowing this releases us from the specter of a gloomy era that was merely the creation of a limited perspective and never really widespread. After making this worldwide comparison, we go back to Europe to examine in detail one particular instance, the Byzantine Empire and the early Islamic world. The notion that the entire world had descended into darkness was immediately refuted by two strongholds of knowledge and power. The map of the medieval world suddenly alters as we remove the Eurocentric perspective. Western Europe was regarded as dark, yet two enormous hubs of knowledge and power were shining brightly next to it. The early Islamic world stretched from Spain to Persia and the Byzantine Empire in the east. Both just kept civilization intact, developed into international information brokers, stoking the flame of the classical past and laying the groundwork for Europe's future renaissance. First, consider Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire that persisted for over a millennium following the collapse of the Western Empire. With its formidable fortifications and advantageous location, Constantinople, its capital, was not just a military stronghold but also a bustling center of culture and commerce. A culture far from darkness is shown by surviving chroniclers, laws, and artwork. The solidus currency did not fluctuate. The court maintained an advanced administration, and trade between the Mediterranean and Black Seas boomed. Later, European law was based on the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Justinian Code. This was not a collapse. The continuation was organized. Additionally, Byzantium preserved an advanced classical education. The writings of Aristocrates, Plato, and Hippocrates were copied and taught at Constantinople's libraries. Byzantine academics did more than just conserve. They produced commentaries and advanced science, philosophy, and theology. Byzantium served as an intellectual bridge to the East, guaranteeing that knowledge would eventually make its way back westward through waves of translation. Even as Western Europe was still fighting to restore order, the early Islamic world, meanwhile, exploded like a tornado. A golden age developed between the 8th and 11th centuries. Cities like Cairo, Cordoba, and Baghdad developed and became major hubs for education worldwide. According to modern sources, there is an incredible transparency. Arabic translations of Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics was taken in systems, were created using local expertise. Algebra was created by a pillar for centuries. The canon of medicine was written by Avicenna, with a Mediterranean-wide influence. Averroes reworked Aristotle. Al-Biruni investigated science and astronomy in ways that foreshadowed contemporary research. The Islamic world was creating, not just conserving. Most importantly, these centers linked information around the world. They revolutionized the creation of books by importing paper from China. They brought the decimal system and the idea of zero from India, ushering in a new age in mathematics. They took philosophy and science from Greece, analyzed and improved them, and then brought them back to Europe. it is hardly hyperbole to suggest that Europe would not have had the intellectual foundation for its Renaissance without this Islamic bridge. This is evident in one location. Islamic Spain's Cordoba is a European island of light. While northern monasteries frequently only saved a few dozen manuscripts, their libraries included hundreds of thousands. Christians, Muslims, and Jews collaborated in translation, discussion, and compilation. Later, a new intellectual stream was created by Latin writings that were brought from Cordoba to France and Italy. This alone demonstrates that the continent was never completely dark. It was alive with an oasis of brilliance. It is evident from the parallel power of Byzantium and the Islamic world that history cannot be boiled down to a single universal night. The East and Mediterranean South continued to be rich, innovative, and intellectually vibrant, while Western Europe was undergoing reorganization. The descriptor dark dissolves when you look broader. From one limited perspective, it seemed black, but from another, it was blazing with light. And when we realize this, there is no denying the necessity of rewriting history. The narrative depicts numerous centers coexisting, deteriorating, thriving, and altering one another, rather than one center sinking into darkness and then rising again. From here, we head back west to see how Rome's imprint persisted in Western Europe in surprising ways, even if it never completely vanished. It is evident from examining Byzantium in the early Islamic world that even after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the light of knowledge and authority persisted. However, the heritage of Rome never really disappeared, especially in Western Europe, which was long believed to be engulfed in darkness. Indeed, the empire fell, but its legacy endured in medieval law, language, infrastructure, and popular memory. Roman law was one of the most obvious continuities. Despite the dissolution of the imperial administration, many of its legal precepts persisted. Legal records from the 6th to the 9th centuries demonstrate that fundamental ideas such as property ownership, inheritance rights, and contractual responsibilities were still in use. Roman influence was mixed with regional custom to create hybrid systems, such as the Anglo-Saxon and Lombard codes or the Frankish Salic law. We learn from reading these documents that Rome did not perish. It changed its disguises. The same story is told by language. Latin continued to be the language of the law, academia, and the church. It brought disparate areas together to form a single intellectual universe. However, it also blended with regional dialects, creating new French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese vernaculars. We are still speaking the airs of Rome when we speak those languages now. Despite the fall of the empire, the Latin language, which was its spirit, never stopped speaking. Rome's shadow was also carried by infrastructure. Despite their wear, Roman roads were nevertheless used for trade and travel. The survival of drainage systems, aqueducts, and bridges influenced how humans planned their environments. Peasants utilizing Roman ruins stones to construct new churches is documented in an 8th century monastery chronicle, evidence that Rome was still there in every block. The concept of the state itself also carries on the Roman heritage. Despite the rise of new barbarian kingdoms, many of these monarchs used Roman images to give themselves credibility. Conquest was not Charlemagne's only goal when he was anointed Holy Roman Emperor in 800. He wanted to establish himself as Caesar's legitimate heir. Dynasty after dynasty continued to evoke Rome as a vital anchor and ideal. The Roman thread was also born by religion. The basilica served as the direct model for early Romanesque churches. Cathedrals and palaces still had mosaics, which were so prevalent across the empire. Despite being Christianized, Roman agricultural festivities managed to preserve their traditional essence. During the Middle Ages, Christianity was not an alien substitute. Rome's customs were assimilated and transformed into a new identity, and the medieval people were keenly conscious of this history. Monks and academics invoked the Imperium Romanum as a close and distant presence in innumerable writings. Rome was not a thing of the past to them. It served as a living memory, a point of comparison, a source of longing, and a basis for asserting continuity. The so-called Dark Ages were actually not a complete departure from Rome. The pieces of the empire were reorganized into new forms throughout this time of change. Rome was never lost. It persisted in all records, roads, traditions, and the political aspirations of those in power. And because Rome had never really abandoned them, it was precisely this continuity that enabled Europe to revitalize Rome throughout the Renaissance. From here, we focus on a single pillar, the church and monasteries, which were the establishment that most effectively preserved Rome's memory and wisdom. They were enduring lights that kept knowledge alive amid instability and made sure that Rome's heritage continued to blaze throughout the medieval era. They were far from being merely conservative or authoritarian. In the minds of the general public, the Church is frequently exclusively associated with conservatism and oppression. However, a much more nuanced reality becomes apparent when we examine the remaining texts and tangible proof in greater detail. Monasteries and the Church emerged as the most resilient pillars in a politically divided Europe, preventing the total collapse of memory, community, and spiritual life. First, there is no denying that monasteries were instrumental in bringing local communities together. Monasteries served as havens and sources of relief while central governments collapsed. According to chronicles, they helped villages recover from raids, rebuilt roads and bridges after wars, and opened granaries during famines. Additionally, local churches did much more than just carry out ceremonies. Priests frequently served as conflict arbitrators, event chroniclers, and elementary Latin teachers. The Church's network served as a stand-in skeleton in a society without the government's guidance, binding millions of people together via common laws and customs. Monasteries served as hubs for the economy as well. They did more than simply pray. They produced beer, reared cattle, tended vineyards for wine, and farmed fields. According to court records, they traded items, hired labor, and even made loans. By doing this, monasteries provided for the local populace and amassed funds for infrastructure repairs and church construction. Cluny in France and Monte Cassino in Italy are examples of surviving complexes that demonstrated that such ambitious constructions would never have been possible if Europe had actually fallen into complete poverty. A shared language and culture were also maintained by the Church. Latin continued to be the common language of law, study, and worship, even as regional dialects changed into French, Italian, German, and other languages. This unity allowed a Spanish document to be read in England and a scholar in Ireland to correspond with a colleague in Italy. Europe would not have been able to regain the cultural unity it required to enter the Renaissance. Without this Latin basis upheld by the Church, an additional dimension was introduced by religious architecture and art, with their lofty vaults and dazzling stained glass. Romanesque and Gothic churches served as both places of worship and hubs of culture. They functioned as monuments of collective creativity that reflected humanity's ambition to achieve greater things, and as stone books that taught scripture to the ignorant. The idea of a gloomy and unchanging Europe is clearly refuted by these pieces, which demonstrate the continent's capacity to mobilize resources and foster artistic talent. The Church does, of course, have a darker side. It occasionally pursued heresy, established doctrine, and regulated belief. Ironically, though, it left behind documents that protected the very range of ideas it sought to stifle. Bans in their detail and heresy trials preserved concepts that may have been lost otherwise. Together, monasteries and the Church supported communities, fostered economies, brought people together culturally, and stimulated artistic creations, becoming the backbone of medieval Europe. Rome's memory was preserved because of them. Shards of civilization were kept intact and waited for the ideal time to re-emerge rather than disperse into obscurity. The green shoots of science, art, and society found fruitful ground from this strong foundation, setting the stage for the major changes of the Renaissance. Education was one of the most obvious signs of rebirth. Originally designed solely to train priests, schools affiliated with churches and monasteries progressively expanded to teach literacy to regular youngsters, a class where peasant children were taught rudimentary Latin is described in a document from the 11th century called Chartres. Although the curriculum was straightforward, it signaled the start of an enduring educational tradition. From then, educational institutions expanded and eventually developed into the core institutions of Western education, the universities of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Art was another green shoot. In addition to demonstrating religious and economic might, the tall Gothic cathedrals, with their dazzling stained glass and the heavy wall, Roman-style churches with their small windows also demonstrated a restless, creative spirit that transcended preservation. Stained glass panels, sculptures, and frescoes depicted more than just the Bible. They depicted everyday life as well. Children playing blacksmiths at work, and peasants harvesting. Medieval art was vibrant and far from silent, setting the stage for the Renaissance's explosion of beauty. Arguments between reason and religion become commonplace in philosophy and thought. Scholastic theology was made possible by the attempts to demonstrate God's existence by reason in the works of Anselm and later Abelard. Despite having religious roots, these early attempts developed a dialectical reasoning technique that would subsequently be used by European philosophy and science. To claim that individuals were learning to reason, debate, and challenge the fundamental practices of science itself during the so-called darkness is not hyperbole. The seeds of transformation might be seen even in social life. In addition to establishing extensive commercial networks, the emergence of the Champagne fairs, which brought together traders from all over Europe, also set the groundwork for urban culture. Small communities developed into guild hubs where artisans banded together, established standards for their vocation, and protected their rights. An essential stage in social evolution is marked by the emergence of a civic awareness separate from the church and nobility, as seen by the first guild charters. The shoots also showed themselves in language and literature. Vernacular languages are starting to appear in literature, as evidenced by old French songs, Anglo-Saxon ballads, and German legends that are dedicated to writing. Dante, Chaucer, and Cervantes were made possible by this movement, which cleared the path for national literature. Stated differently, the emergence of the vernacular signified a long-lasting cultural shift. Even the beginnings of scientific reasoning can be seen in some writings. Initially created to fix religious holidays, astronomical records have evolved into more accurate measurements of planetary movement. Galen was no longer quoted verbatim in medical texts. They featured first-hand experiments and herbal treatments from the area. Technical intelligence was alive, as evidenced by architectural sketches and notes on mechanical toys, which prepared the way for the major inventions of the later Middle Ages. Above all, these green shoots were always a part of everyday life. They were born out of actual needs: philosophy to dispel doubts, medicine to heal, art to unite communities, education to educate literacy, and laws to control trade. They persisted because they were grounded in commonplace necessity. This explains why these seedlings flowered into the thriving forest of the Renaissance a few centuries later, when the right conditions were present. In retrospect, the Dark Ages weren't a vacuum. They resembled a protracted winter in which seeds were concealed beneath the ground. Everything appeared to be motionless from above, but life was still going on below, getting ready for spring, as evidenced by manuscripts, artifacts, and daily logs. Only until the day it rose again, stronger than before, did it cover it. Debate and dispute are inevitable as our story draws to a close, and new information compels contemporary historians to reinterpret the concept of the Dark Ages. For history is never merely a collection of facts. It is our interpretation of that information, the context in which we situate it, and the narrative we tell ourselves about ourselves. This is the opposite side of history. It is a continuous, perhaps heated, discussion between opposing viewpoints, rather than a report that is objective. Despite indications of vitality, decline was very real, according to one group of academics. They cite the decline of Roman urban infrastructure, including the deserted amphitheaters, the deteriorating roads, and the dwindling cities. They have chronicles of depopulation, pestilence, and starvation. They believe that just because we discovered a few peppercorns in a grave or a few copies of manuscripts doesn't mean that there isn't widespread sorrow and loss. According to this perspective, darkness is a metaphor for true crises rather than an absolute state. On the other hand, some contend that the term Dark Ages was faulty from the beginning. They remind us that history is never one-dimensional. Yes, there was loss, but there was also change, inventiveness, and continuity. To describe it as dark is to ignore the centuries during which people continued to trade, farm, write letters, write poetry, and study the stars. In addition to being unjust to the past, that designation skews our perception of human advancement. They suggest that rather than viewing it as a time of darkness, we should view it as a transitional period, an early Middle Age with a unique character that shouldn't be unfairly compared to the Renaissance or Rome. There is a lot of room for discussion between these poles. Certain academics use a regional approach, recognizing that although certain regions flourished like Italy or Spain, which are tied to the Islamic world, others, like Britain, following Rome's retreat, plunged into serious decline. Others highlight the global setting. When China, India, and the Islamic world were at their heights, can we really say that the 7th through 10th centuries were dark? They contend that the true question is whether we can broaden our perspective to accept a multipolar viewpoint, rather than whether the era was brilliant or dark. Storytelling is also up for dispute, because dark periods are vivid, understandable, and educationally beneficial. Should we continue to utilize them as a metaphor for decline? Or should we give it up completely because it erases richness and harbors Eurocentric prejudice? Some educators continue to educate pupils in critical reflection by using the word, albeit with disclaimers. Others have completely abandoned it in favor of the early Middle Ages, since language impacts the mind. This is not merely a scholarly dispute, but a debate over language in general. These conflicts are only heightened by recent scientific discoveries. Every new discovery made by archaeology or by AI deciphering a manuscript is interpreted differently. It could be interpreted as evidence of continuity by one historian in the context of decline. Another would refer to it as an exception. This very difference demonstrates that discoveries are not the end of history. It merely adds further levels of discussion, and that's ultimately what makes history come to life. Disagreement does not indicate anarchy. Vitality is demonstrated by it. History is never a set narrative. It is constantly recounted, questioned, and contested. Furthermore, this strengthens the discipline rather than weakens it, because every viewpoint compels us to search more thoroughly, ask more questions, and avoid the ease of making assumptions. These discussions touch on cultural identity on a deeper level. We must acknowledge that much of Europe's self-story was based on a false contrast that reshapes not only history but also Europe's perception of itself in the larger world. If we acknowledge that the Dark Ages were a myth created to exalt the Renaissance, and while some traditional academics find that unsettling, others embrace it as an opportunity to break the mold of historical imagination. Ultimately, it is evident that dispute and debate are not flaws, but rather the very pulse of history. Finding a single, unchanging truth has never been the goal of history. It has always been about repeatedly expanding our horizons. A bigger question comes up after all the heated arguments. How many of the Sokolata Age's mysteries are still unsolved? We must question what power still resides in the unread books, the dirt beneath our feet, or even in familiar structures whose walls may yet hold untold stories, if a small number of manuscripts, trade agreements, or private letters were sufficient to append the outdated perception of history. The first thing to keep in mind is the enormous amount of unspoiled material. Millions of manuscripts, many of which have never been thoroughly examined, are still kept in monasteries, cathedrals, and royal archives throughout Europe. There are miles of shelves filled with documents at the Vatican alone, some of which have not been opened since the 17th century. These include innumerable medieval copies that include information about everyday life, the law, and knowledge that could revolutionize our comprehension of a whole era. Then there are thepalimpsests, which are parchments that have been written over and scraped, yet are still present in large quantities using multispectral imaging. Every year, researchers find additional levels. It might be a passing remark about Aristotle now, but tomorrow it might be a lost book or a forgotten private journal. There are surprises hidden beneath the ink, just waiting to be discovered by technology. Likewise, archaeology has just touched the surface. Modern streets still cover many medieval cities. Every dig yields new information. Tools, houses, and markets. In York, wooden items, wheat grains, and even fertilizer residues were kept by the soggy soil. Vital information for recreating daily life. Recent excavations in Germany have revealed public baths and drainage systems that were far older than previously believed. The outdated perception of poverty and stagnation is further damaged by each new location. Furthermore, the concealed evidence is not limited to Europe. How many artifacts from the Islamic world, China, or India are still strewn around in ports in Europe? How many remnants of trade across continents are still buried? A Byzantine pendant in Scandinavia, an Islamic coin in England, and a piece of Chinese porcelain in Venice. Every tiny item has the power to alter the course of world trade, and there are undoubtedly many such items out there that have not yet been found. More opportunities are being created by new technology. Our understanding of plague has already been altered by ancient DNA research that is only 20 years old. The outlines of abandoned settlements, hidden beneath farms and forests, are being revealed by satellite images and artificial intelligence. Our date is still being improved via radiocarbon and isotope studies. This implies that there is an annual opportunity to rewrite medieval history by the gradual accumulation of minor discoveries rather than through significant revolutions. Fact that we are unable to predict the source of the next breakthrough is what makes this so interesting. Astronomy may get fresh insights from a lost document. A medieval metropolis bigger than anyone could have ever dreamed could be discovered. During an excavation, this new information might make us reconsider how Europe interacted with other cultures, possibly demonstrating that its influences from India and Arabia were more extensive than previously thought. Every potentiality resembles a branch that is only waiting to reach the sun. For this reason, the Dark Ages are an open file rather than a closed chapter. They resemble a heavy book with numerous pages that are still adhered. With every new finding, we are able to read more, see more, and comprehend more. In the process, we discover that history is a woven fabric that may be repaired, rethreaded, or even completely rewoven rather than a set wall. And now, as this episode draws to a close, it's just the two of us sitting quietly together. When we look back, we can see a reality. According to what we were told, the Dark Ages never ever happened. Indeed, there were wrecked towns, epidemics, wars, and difficult lives. But in addition to all of that, there were thriving trade channels, meticulously drafted regulations, knowledge seeds blossoming, artistic creations, and a thriving religious environment. Therefore, the lack of light was never darkness. The light was only concealed for a little period, anxiously awaiting our discovery. Human perseverance in the face of adversity is the most important lesson to be learnt from this so-called gloom. The peasants who shared their grain to prevent starvation, the merchants who risked their lives at sea, the monks who copied texts in the cold, and the academics who discussed philosophy in cloisters. They all demonstrated that people never gave up to their circumstances. Humans managed to maintain order, protect memory, produce art, and foster optimism despite the fall of empires and the destruction of infrastructure. No matter how many layers of prejudice were put on top of it, that persistence, that silent river beneath the surface, could never be smothered. Therefore, darkness was a symbol for difficulty rather than a scourge of history. It serves as a reminder that while all civilizations experience decay, fresh seedlings always sprout among the debris. Even though winters are long, spring always comes. History provides us with an everlasting lesson when seen in this light. Even if humanity falters, it never stops talking. It always retains memory, even if it loses a lot, even though it suffers. It continues to weave hope for the future, and we start to view history differently once we comprehend this, no longer as a straightforward conflict between light and darkness, but rather as a multi-layered tapestry in which both are woven into elaborate designs. In addition to teaching us about the past, history also teaches us how to view the present, that innovation is possible even during times of distress, and the human spirit's tenacity constantly manages to go onwards. However, this is not the conclusion of the adventure, because challenging the notion of the Dark Ages forces us to reevaluate how we interpret history itself. How many more chapters need to be changed if a whole millennium might be syllabelled? What percentage of manuscripts have not been deciphered? What is the number of buried artifacts? How many memories remain hidden in the common imagination or in the shadows of archives? History is fascinating because of this uncertainty. It is a manuscript that has been left open with numerous pages remaining adhered to one another, not a closed book. Every new discovery, every generation adds a sentence, removes another, and contributes to the collective history of humanity. And for that reason, we need to foster inquiry. The flame that never goes out is curiosity, the inspiration that pushes us to look further, pay more attention, and never settle for just one explanation. Ultimately, history is not a solution. It's a quest, a never-ending adventure where each new finding just leads to further inquiries. Therefore, we are not really coming to an end when we close the chapter on the Dark Ages. All we are doing is stopping, inhaling deeply, gazing up at the unwritten pages, and wondering how much more light lies in the darkness of history. Thank you for joining Secret Historian on this extraordinary journey into the warnings left behind by those who vanished. If you believe the past still holds wisdom, if you know deep down that history was never a sleep only, waiting, subscribe now to Secret Historian.